News and the images of the Marikana massacre made headlines around the globe for weeks. What the world didn't take into account was that who and what it took to bring that news from the small town of Rustenburg to the world. And this is a story that journalist and author Gia Nicolaides brought to bear in her book, Frontline Untold Stories from Marikana, first published in 2015. Gia now joins us to recount her harrowing experiences that would later serve as an inspiration for the book and its story. Gia, thank you so much for your time. Obviously a very, very tough day today. Gia, you were there the moment police opened fire on the miners that afternoon. Where were you at the time? What was going through your mind in the moments leading up to that shooting?
Well, Unathi, I think we were all preparing for some kind of tense altercation between the police and the miners. They had for days been occupying the now infamous Kopi, and the police were trying to disarm and disperse them. But after negotiations failed, the police called us and they told us that they were going to move to a tactical phase. So we saw the water cannons coming in. We then realized that they were going to be using stun grenades, water cannons, rubber bullets. And almost in an instant, things changed, and you could actually feel the tense feeling on the ground. I immediately hid behind one of the police nyalas, and it was only after that that I realized that live ammunition had gone off. And following those moments, I actually went to the scene, and I could see that several mine workers were lying in the field, and it was clear to me that at least 5 that I had counted were killed.
Now, what was going through your mind at that moment? I mean, in your book, you describe the smell, you describe the senses that you felt when it shifted from firing bullets, when they were using live ammunition instead of rubber bullets. You could hear the change in that ammunition, and before it was too long, you realized what had happened. What was going through your mind at that very moment when you were covering behind that police van?
I was absolutely terrified, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. Was it just rubber bullets that were being fired? I was watching as some of the police officers were jumping back into the nyala as some of those miners were moving forward towards the police. But hearing those sounds, those gunshots, my ears started ringing. My mouth went dry. I went into a state of panic. But almost immediately, I looked down at my recorder to check that it was recording. Because as a journalist, as you would know, Unathi, you have to try and capture every moment. So while I was panicking inside and while I was terrified, not knowing exactly how many people had been killed in that moment, I almost had to slip into that journalist mode so that I could properly tell the story afterwards.
Now let's pause here, Gia. Let me introduce NUMSA spokesperson Phakamile Majola, who is joining us via Skype. Now, Phakamile was a journalist and covered the Marikana massacre days leading up to that massacre. Phakamile, thank you so much for joining us and for your time this afternoon. Now, Phakamile, 8 years on, and the Marikana massacre remains ingrained in our minds. Take us through your experience, leading up to that massacre when you were reporting at the time.
Afternoon, and thank you for having me on the show. It was a very difficult time. I must say that reporting on the Marikana massacre transformed me fundamentally as a human being and as a journalist. I was never the same after that day. Because of what I experienced and what I had witnessed and what I had seen. I think for me what was really disturbing in the days leading up to this event was you had a protracted strike which had been taking place at Lonmin Mines. I'd been asked at that time, I was working at ENCA, and we arrived there, I think it was the 14th or the 13th, if I'm not mistaken. And we'd been told about how violence was escalating during the strike. Security guards had been murdered, and the situation was getting out of hand. And so we were asked to then come and cover the situation. And you arrive in Marikana, the area is desperately poor. Desperately poor. People are living in shacks. There's no water. There's no electricity. And right slap bang in the sea of poverty is this Lonmin mines and a very advanced mining house. And, you know, that for me was the first thing that hit me, was that juxtaposition of the extreme wealth of this corporation, literally sucking the wealth out of the ground while surrounded by a sea of shacks. So you were walking into that context, and that was actually at the heart of why these workers had been on strike for so long.
Now, Phakamile, thanks for that. Now, Gia is in fact in the studio and she recounts some of her memories in her book. But take us through, specifically for you, Phakamile, at the time, a woman journalist who was not welcomed at the Kopi, the miners refusing female journalists from reporting the story. What was going through your mind? I mean, you talk about the juxtaposition of poverty and also the fight for human rights by the miners. You had to report the story, but at the same time, you're probably fearing for your own safety because the miners were not receptive to women journalists.
It was a very complicated situation because I think first of all, we have to be very clear to separate groups of miners. So this is what was happening. There were some mine employees who were very helpful, who were engaging us. But as you were closer to the Kopi, where a lot of miners had been gathered and where they were basically protesting against their conditions, that area and that space had been designated as a sacred space. And in terms of their rules, only men were allowed. People who were there, like, you weren't allowed to be there with a cell phone. It was, in their view, a sacred space. It was a space where they could come together and strengthen themselves and each other and fight in terms of what they were battling against, with the demands they were making against the employer. And so we were coming in there. It was myself and another female journalist, video journalist, Thando Hlophe. And we've been instructed by our editor, we need to get footage of these mine workers gathering on the Kopi and two women coming into this space. So yes, on that day, that was the 14th of August, just 2 days before the massacre. It was a very tense moment. There was a time when our lives were threatened, where some men claiming to be mine workers threatened our lives and wanted to kill us, and we actually narrowly escaped that situation. So it was a really, really difficult time, and I think what made it really even worse was the fact that you had a management which was completely refusing to engage these workers. I remember being part of that press conference with the head of HR, who was also giving his account on the situation. And one of the questions was asked was, are you going to speak to mine workers? Some of these are your members. They've raised issues about their conditions. They've raised issues about their living conditions. And the response was a flat-out refusal. And the whole situation, where it was clearly a labor dispute, was sort of being handed over to the police for the police to resolve. And we should not be surprised that that situation ended in utter bloodshed as it did on that day.
Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to put on your union hat. But, Gia, let me ask you this. What would justice look like for the Marikana survivors and also the families that are left behind? I mean, we heard this afternoon in the 8th year commemoration that justice is yet to be served.
That's right. I think justice would be served if we had some answers to the questions that the families of those victims have been asking for, some form of compensation. And a lot of the time, and over the years, they've been promised compensation, but that's never really come through. And I think to actually have some people prosecuted, because we are 8 years on, and we know that some minors have been charged and their case has been postponed for various reasons, but to this day, not one police officer has actually been charged or prosecuted for the killings in Marikana. So I still think that 8 years on, despite having a very lengthy commission of inquiry, we still don't have the answers that we've been looking for.
Now, you went back to that place where those miners were gunned down, where you recorded in your book 9 months later. Have you gone back since? Will you go back? What is the memory that you are taking after that experience that you've had?
I did go back a few times afterwards, but I haven't been back in a few years. It is difficult for me to go back. And one of the main reasons is that every time I did go back, I expected things to change in Marikana. The Nkaneng informal settlement, which is on the outskirts of the Lonmin mine, as Phakamile had described, not much had changed for those families. They were still looking for running water, toilets, and I just feel that it was heartbreaking to return year after year and seeing very little change. Yes, sometimes Lonmin or the municipality would come forward with some new initiative to try and improve the lives of the mine workers and their families. But I didn't see major changes. And for me, that was the most heartbreaking part, to go back every year and not see anything being improved.
Now, Phakamile, you are here obviously in your capacity as a former journalist. You've experienced what Gia has also experienced during that time. But if you had to put your union hat on this afternoon for us, what do you think is the responsibility of unions when you have a situation like Marikana where employers and employees are at loggerheads and the situation is dangerous at the time? What is the responsibilities of unions in that instance?
I think the responsibility of a union in any dispute is to defend the rights of workers. The purpose and the existence of a trade union is to defend workers and to fight for their rights. That is what they have to put first and foremost. There were many failures when it came to Marikana. There was failure in terms of union leadership in some respects. I know people have critiqued the role of the NUM in particular in terms of how this matter should or could have been handled better. And certainly, based on my experience as a journalist, huge failure on the side of Lonmin management to try and resolve this crisis peacefully. I believe very strongly, even then as a journalist at that time and even today, that there were many times and many opportunities when Lonmin management actually could have stepped in a progressive way and the dispute could have ended peacefully. And they chose not to, and to their detriment, unfortunately. I think also, but the buck ultimately stops with government. Lonmin is a clear example of many, many mining companies in South Africa today that have not lived up to the promises that they made in their social labor plans when they applied for licenses in the first place. Many of them extract billions from the ground. Workers live in abject poverty, in shocking working conditions. 8 years after the Marikana massacre, workers at Lonmin mines, particularly contract workers who we represent, earn only 4,000 rands a month. So that shows you that unfortunately their deaths were in vain. So there is a massive responsibility on the side of this government, which for more than 20 years has failed to genuinely transform the lives of the black working class, where even today South African mining resembles the type of mining houses that we had under the bad old days of apartheid, and workers still suffer shocking working and living conditions.
Gia, let me end this interview with you. Phakamile has said that the massacre of 16 August 2012 has fundamentally changed her life. Now, do you think that 16 August 2012, that day, changed anything in the psyche of South Africans?
I think it did, and even if it was for a short period of time, because it was the first time that we focused in on workers' issues. And one of the important things is, at the time when we arrived at the scene, the mine workers were reluctant to speak to us. We've spoken about the copy being considered as a sacred ground. But usually, as a journalist, when you went to any protest, you would arrive there and the protesters would be willing to speak to the media because we are their voice. This time it was a bit different, and it took us a while to build up that trust with those mine workers. And after the massacre, it focused on the ability of the police, how they handled the situation, what the police can do differently going forward, but also when the mine workers decided not to be affiliated to any union. UMCU was just starting up and had been accused at the time of stealing members from the NUM. But those mine workers who gathered on the copy, and there were around 3,000 of them, they decided not to affiliate themselves with any union. They wanted to be represented themselves. And that's where Lonmin actually fell short, because they didn't recognize them, they didn't want to negotiate with them, they wanted them to go through a union. And unfortunately, it turned out the way it did. But I think that South Africans will forever remember that day of the shooting. We will always remember that 34 miners were gunned down on the 16th of August, but we also mustn't forget the 10 others who were killed in the days leading up to the 16th of August.
Ladies, thank you so much for your time. Gia Nicolaides, a reporter and also a frontline author of Untold Stories for Marikana. Thank you so much for that. And of course, former journalist Phakamile Hlubi Majola.